Atomic Heart has been eagerly anticipated by many, but by far the most excited demographic are those of us who have been waiting for a spiritual successor to the BioShock franchise for a decade. Atomic Heart, coming from a brand new studio that's literally never released a title before, has been very upfront with their inspirations, and there are even musical, visual, and dialogue Easter eggs throughout this entire game that the developers have placed in here so people remember what started all of this. And that's certainly a high bar. BioShock is beloved by many people for a very good reason, and so the question at the core of this review is whether or not Atomic Heart can live up to the aspirations and inspirations of its predecessor, and also whether or not it can add something unique to the formula and something that makes this game worth playing for its own sake. After playing through the roughly 20-hour campaign and a few hours of the side content, I can say that Atomic Heart is a competent attempt to emulate the beloved franchise, but unfortunately, it falls very flat towards the end thanks to its poor enemy variety, inconsistent difficulty scaling, terrible pacing, and disappointingly bland campaign and set pieces that come along after the first few hours, which are in contrast very, very well done. While this is easy to recommend on Game Pass, for a full $70, this becomes a much more difficult recommendation. And we're about to get into all of the details as to why, so buckle up. I will also say we don't have a sponsor for this review, so I'm not going to blabber your ear off about any of that stuff. All I would ask is that if you enjoy this video, you subscribe, like it, because that apparently makes a big difference. And if you want to hang out with me live and ask me questions about the game and hang out just in general, I live stream over on Luke Stevens Live here on YouTube. Just search in the search bar, Luke Stevens Live for live streaming and come hang out. We're live every Monday, Wednesday, Friday when these videos go up. So I'm live right now as this video is published. So if you have questions or stuff that I don't answer in this review, come by and I'd be happy to answer your questions. But with that, enough blabbering, let's get into it. My first impressions of Atomic Heart were very good. The introduction really is beautiful, the production value is top notch, and they managed to recapture that same feeling I had when first experiencing Rapture and Columbia in the BioShock games. And that's a really high bar to meet. So I was really excited to see what the opening hours of the game would hold. Would they maintain this level of quality, or would they prove to be much more bland with all of the effort and production value having gone into this opening section? And well, yeah, I think you probably can figure out what the answer is. After such an impressive opening, the game comes to a screeching halt almost immediately. We've just been shown a world that's really interesting, that's beautiful, and that we want to explore and get to know better, but instead of being given the opportunity to do that, we're forced to go through hallway after hallway, laboratory after laboratory, and fight dozens upon dozens of identical humanoid androids that, while initially kind of interesting with their aggressive movesets, grow repetitive as time goes on and lose all fun factor. Now, I knew when I was playing it that this game had a lot more to offer in the coming hours, specifically with the boss fights that were shown off before the game's launch in all of those trailers. So I looked forward to that, and that was the one thing that got me through this section of the game. To be more specific, in the opening few hours of the game, you'll be tasked with completing a variety of extremely tedious tasks. Most of these activities are in various underground bunkers and laboratories contained within large buildings. At one point in the first 3 hours of the game, you'll be tasked with collecting 2 small orbs that are used to power up the doors you need to go through to progress on to the next area that's filled with identical androids and puzzles and things for you to work through. However, once you've retrieved these 2 orbs in what can only be really described as a fetch quest, you'll be tasked with yet again collecting 4 more items in order to open up the door immediately after this one. It's like tasking the player to complete some super tedious fetch quest that isn't fun or interesting and then sending them back because they grabbed the wrong thing. It's just bafflingly boring bloat buttressing an otherwise beautifully balanced opening. And to add insult to injury, the developers were aware that this was frustratingly boring and that it killed the pace, which is why they actually wrote in dialogue for the protagonist to joke about it being boring.
Who the hell came up with all this shit? I'm sick to death of shoving balls into tubes.
We're doing this so we can leave the Vavilov complex.
Why can't I just, I don't know, walk out a regular door?
I'm afraid only an irregular door is available.
P3, the game's main character, has multiple quips he makes to your companion in the form of a glove about how uninteresting this is and how he wishes he was up on the surface where things are more interesting. And while some people may think of this as a cool way of breaking the fourth wall to show that they are self-aware and the authors know exactly what's going on, I don't think it actually excuses the sin in this case. Just because somebody is aware that something in their product doesn't work or is bad doesn't mean that that thing magically becomes justified. If Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, starts joking about how iPhone's batteries are terrible, you might laugh and be like, oh, he's aware, he knows what's going on. But that doesn't make it okay to have batteries that are terrible in your product. Like, cool, you're aware of it, but why am I supposed to just go along with it now? Unfortunately, this was the first sign of what was to come throughout the entire game's campaign. And to be clear, it's not an unforgivable sin to have a sluggish intro to your game. One of my favorite games from my childhood was Assassin's Creed 3, and that game famously didn't give you control of the main character until roughly 7 hours into the main story, because they had you playing as somebody else entirely for that entire time through the whole intro and prologue and everything. Like, the whole length of a lot of games you were spent playing some other character. It was just weird. The point is, games can certainly overcome a clunky, sluggish intro. It's not unforgivable. However, in order to overcome such an incredible stumble out of the gate, Atomic Heart needs to come out swinging in its middle act and in the final act. Otherwise, players will simply never recover from the extremely frustrating and boring intro that starts amazingly well with this fantastic visualization of a utopia that seems too good to be true, that only then devolves into pure monotony after just half an hour. The fact that the opening hour is so impressive and so filled with high production value set pieces, cinematics, and carefully animated and scripted sequences, it makes it all the more frustrating to see how bland this intro is after these moments, because you've tasted the forbidden fruit and seen what a super high production value version of this world could be like. It's like a kid going to Disneyland and being told that they have to go sit in the bathroom for the whole day. It's like, you just saw the amazing thing over there, but now you have to go sit in a corner inside a dark, cold room that's totally uninteresting. It's just like, okay, well, screw you, dude. But moving on from the terrible intro, as you go through the first 10 hours, you'll get access to a handful of weapons, whether that be the shotgun, the basic pistol, an electric pistol, different melee weapons, a grenade launcher, railgun, etc., etc. Furthermore, you'll also unlock the first few upgrades to these weapons and to your overall loadout. You can upgrade your max health, inventory size, which I will say is a must because it's frustratingly small by default, and all of the various guns that you can use feel pretty responsive. And I didn't find myself actively avoiding any one of these weapons, as they all felt pretty interchangeable in terms of usefulness. The one potential note I have for this would be the shotgun. Before you make a handful of upgrades to it, it's barely more useful than the starter pistol, if not actively worse, because it can only have 4 shells loaded at a time. More often than not, it actually just feels like a potato cannon rather than a shotgun, as the damage just doesn't seem to be where it needs to be to justify its use. In my opinion, this thing should be way more effective at close range, and frankly, on all difficulty settings, I think this thing should be a one-shot kill if struck to the head of an android at close range. The fact that on medium and hard difficulties, androids can take a shotgun blast to the head multiple times and not so much as flinch is a little bit ridiculous to me. But don't worry, I have a lot more to say on difficulty in just a minute. You will also unlock your first handful of glove abilities in these opening hours as well. Did you get it? Your first handful of glove ability. Moving on. There's a few of these different abilities you can load in, which would be directly analogous to the plasmids in BioShock. You'll gain the shock ability, which is used for puzzles and can also be used for combat if it's upgraded so that it can deal damage to enemies. You can use the freeze effect, which is pretty self-explanatory. You can gain the ability to cast a shield around yourself, which helps when you're being swarmed, and even a telekinetic power that can lift enemies up and slam them down for added damage after it's been upgraded, among others as well. These operate on on basic cooldowns instead of on separate salts or a mana gauge like a lot of other games that have systems similar to this. And as to whether you like or dislike this, it's going to be pretty much a matter of personal opinion, since you won't be able to spam one ability 10 times in a row to get out of a sticky situation while draining your mana, but rather you'll be able to use it perpetually without the need to collect random refills, albeit with a slight delay. It all feels relatively robust, and while I think that there could be some tweaking done with some of the guns to make them more useful in given instances like the shotgun at close range, the railgun at longer range, I think in general they get the job done. Now, I also experimented a good amount with the difficulty options, and let me just say, this game can be extremely difficult if you want it to be. You see, there's 3 difficulties, basically hard, regular, or medium, and what is the narrative or easy option. On the medium difficulty, enemies hit like a truck, and on hard, they can basically one-shot slap you into oblivion. Call me a noob all you want, the medium difficulty setting in this game feels like hard for most first-person shooters, and hard feels like the crushing or grounded difficulty. It's like actually ridiculous. Maybe they'll balance it with a day 1 patch, which I know they're working on, and they'll have stuff to put out that will balance things a little bit, but at least the version of the game I played was like actually ridiculous. Now, going with this, for the version of the game that I played as it was balanced, the regular difficulty option and the harder difficulty option often didn't feel fair in my experimentation, simply with how much damage these androids can take and how much they can, in turn, dish out. As I alluded to earlier, you can have a shotgun and blast an android in the face with it, and they will be totally fine on the hard difficulty. And you can do this a few times before they even so much as flinch. Whereas on lower difficulty levels, such as on the easier narrative option or on the medium difficulty setting, it's clear that headshots seem to do increased damage to androids, and they will either be 1 or 2 tapped by them. So to be clear, it's not one of those things where, say, all of the computing components are actually inside the center of the body of the android, so headshots don't actually do additional damage. In this world, they do. And so I just want to make that clear before somebody in the comments is like, well, actually, Luke, the computing unit for the android is in the body, so if you're shooting the head, it's no surprise they don't feel any added pain or damage. Like, hold your horses. Okay, in this world, apparently it does have a difference with the head being the focus, and you know what I'm talking about. Okay, shut up. I'll also say there may be some increased difficulty tied to the AI, or at least the number of enemies that swarm to you when alert levels max out. But after roughly 25 hours with this game, I have to say that I really was not able to tell anything like this. There's nothing in this game like in The Last of Us Part 2 where enemies start to behave much more human and intelligently on higher difficulties. Honestly, it just feels the exact same from easy to medium to hard. What I will say is this game definitely embraces its difficulty. And all told, don't feel ashamed if you decide to knock the difficulty down a peg. I don't think there's any shame in that. This is a very difficult game, and even the easy setting can be pretty tough at times. Like I said, maybe they'll balance this, and maybe the day 1 patch will come out and you'll be like, oh my god, Luke, normal is like so easy. What are you talking about? The version of the game I played with is like actually ridiculous, so that's just what I'm reporting to you. But aside from the combat, you'll be going through the main story with the protagonist named P3. He also has a Russian name, but I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, so I'm just going to leave it here. His nickname is P3. They call him P3 through the whole story, so that's what I'm going with. Okay. Now, during the opening 5 or so hours of the game, and I might be alone in this, let me just say that, I found him to be painfully unlikable. P3 is rash, he's kind of whiny, and he has moments where he says things that are seemingly out of character in an attempt to be funny, again in moments that really just don't seem to call for it. Such as in this moment in the opening hours where we're riding in the train and it gets attacked by a giant robot, at which point he yells out crispy critters for some inexplicable reason. Now, I don't know if this is like some sort of inside joke that I'm not aware of, or this is a reference to something and I'm just the boomer who doesn't know about it. But like, I kid you not, I've counted at least 9 instances of P3 yelling out crispy critters in randomly inappropriate times where like it's kind of serious. Somebody just died and he's like talking to somebody who's very upset about it. And then something big happens. And he's like, oh, crispy critters. It's freaking weird. I feel like I'm missing something. But it's not just P3 that's unlikable. Other than the granny, the badass old lady that you meet during the opening that we saw in trailers years ago, everybody that you meet through the story is absolutely insufferable. And they sit confidently also in the uncanny valley, such that during most cutscenes, you'll be left grimacing instead of engaged. Where BioShock had memorable and even charismatic characters at the helm, Atomic Heart fails to meet that same standard. Rather, most of the characters you'll be encountering serve one narrative purpose, and most of the time, that is to die in a gory way to introduce a combat section. Especially with how quirky some of the characters in the opening hour were, I was really excited to see some wacky individuals pop up during the campaign, but unfortunately, they all just disappear. Some of them appear later in the main campaign and pop in to say hi or have a couple lines of dialogue later, but that's really it. But after all this, the game starts to settle into somewhat of a groove from hours 5 to like 18 before the finale, right around hour 20, and it's not bad. I had fun. It opens up the overworld to you, and you'll immediately start to put the combat system to the test, since there are technically endless waves of robots to fight once you're up top. The combat is punchy, but unfortunately it's held back by a severe lack of enemy variety. After about 5 hours, you will have seen everything that is in this game in terms of enemies, except for a couple of bosses that you'll be fighting later that you will then see reused. The guns themselves are serviceable, the customization is a welcome addition as well, however the incremental improvements are certainly minimal. I never made an upgrade to a weapon and thought to myself, wow, this is great now. They were always very small and incremental improvements, which I wouldn't notice if I wasn't looking for them. Almost all of the enemy types, including androids, have certain weaknesses, which if you understand them, can make them much easier to clear out quickly. The ability to attach small canisters that apply elemental effects onto your weapons after they've been upgraded moderately is a cool addition, making it so that you can add fire, electric effects, or freezing effects to your weapons, but these canisters run out fairly quickly, meaning that you either need to craft them or find them while you explore the world in order to continue using them. Nonetheless, it's still a nice tool to have in your repertoire in case you encounter some particularly difficult enemies, simply because these enemies will effectively require you to use their elemental weaknesses, otherwise you will be bashing your head against the wall due to their extremely high HP level on higher difficulties. If you run out of these canisters, you better hope that you have some high DPS weapons like the Fat Man grenade launcher, otherwise you will be in for a very long fight where you will probably be running out of ammo and have to resort to bashing them over the head with a baseball bat that has saw blades attached to it for 10 minutes until their massive HP pool has been depleted. There are also energy weapons which are charged up by completing melee attacks, and this gives you an ammo-free solution for longer encounters, but I never found it really viable as the really tough enemies don't let you close for longer than maybe one hit. And on medium and high difficulty, that's certainly enough to kill you in one shot in a lot of instances, so I never found this to be super viable. Furthermore, crafting ammo really is not a big deal. You basically do it in these small rooms that also have save checkpoints for you, and these rooms are so numerous that you will find them pretty much at every autosave point in the game. So whenever you start to run out of ammo after a major combat sequence, you just waltz into the next room after looting the room that you just cleared out, and then you can just craft whatever ammunition that you need. And as I mentioned earlier, once you get the inventory upgrade, you can carry pretty much anything that you would possibly need for any given encounter. The level design and encounter arrangement goes between fine and surprisingly good in some cases. I remember there was one laboratory I was going through around halfway through the story, and I kept getting frustrated because I was faced with a barrage from a couple of extremely difficult enemies. These things are straight up mini bosses and even have their own health bar that pops up at the top of the screen when they're engaged. They will even chase you between zones and loading screens. These things are absolutely relentless. And I kept getting killed by them, and I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong until, upon reloading after a death, I realized that what had been happening is that the enemy was stored in a large glass cylinder in the room that I was entering. And when I was initially going into the room to clear out the other grunt enemies, I was accidentally shooting open the glass cylinder behind the grunts with bullets that missed or went through them, which allowed the high tier enemy to escape, making that encounter much more difficult. So basically, I had been making this section of the game way harder than it needed to be, simply because I was careless in how I approached the encounter. There is sort of a stealth mechanic here where you can stealth behind androids and then manually override them, and and on hard, I'm sure that's much more viable and useful, but I found that to be kind of the lamest way to play this game, and so I usually didn't engage with stealth, but I'm sure if you wanted to make that your main approach, you probably could make it work. This level of dynamism within level design is awesome, and it certainly makes me wonder how many other times I had made things more difficult on myself without realizing it. The open world design, however, is just frankly bad. There are a handful of small areas to find, and there are even dungeons that you can explore within this overworld. These things are filled with puzzles and sometimes enemies, and they always have useful schematics and crafting materials within them. These are all super useful, and you should definitely go through them when you have the chance, but it's important to note that that's not very often. The main campaign clips along at a very steady pace, and it never really feels as though it's welcoming you to explore and complete those side activities. And this means that you will have to put a very urgent task on hold just to go dink around and find some crafting materials, something which just doesn't sit right if you're trying to take the narrative seriously. After all, many people are dying as a result of this seemingly intentional terroristic mass glitch or hack that has caused the helpful automatons to turn violent. And furthermore, the end of the game's story comes out of almost nowhere. I began the final mission thinking that it was the start of what was hopefully to be a multi-hour finale filled with a handful of boss fights, new areas, and so I was certainly surprised when a half hour later the credits were rolling. And it's important to note that after the main story ends, you can't continue exploring, so the only way you could go back and complete those dungeons that you probably haven't done yet because you didn't realize the game was ending would be to go back and load into previous save files, hoping to God that the autosave caught a moment far enough back in the story that it would allow you to go back into the open area of the map, which would at least then mean that you could go back and complete those extra areas. But then you would have to go all the way back through roughly an hour of content in the main story just to get back to the finale to use your new kitted up weapons using the blueprints you collected from those extra dungeons. The whole way they've structured this is just really strange. It's like they wanted to give you an open world to explore and loot, but the team handling the main story and the team that decided where the player would actually be from chapter to chapter had no knowledge of the open world element. I have little doubt that there will actually be many people who probably will play through this entire game without realizing that it has a semi-open world for you to explore. It's just really bizarre and frankly poorly done. Honestly, it feels kind of like they were working on an open world sort of Far Cry style of game, and then at one point they were like, okay, that's just not feasible, so we'll make it more linear. But they already had done this work to build out part of the open world, so they said, we'll just leave it in. We'll do both, and we'll kind of give people access to it where they have sort of an open world, but it's still kind of just a linear game. And as a result, they just have a linear game that has a really weird overworld on top of it, and it just doesn't work. But setting all of that aside, we do get a handful of boss fights, which were shown heavily in the promotional materials before the game launched. These were the things that got me particularly excited for this game because from what we saw, these were very high production value boss fights, and if they were showing these boss fights in trailers, surely the game would have a lot more to offer that was even better, because surely they wouldn't just show the coolest stuff in the game during the trailers. Like, of course, they would probably save some stuff for players to discover while playing, right? Right? No, I'm not joking when I say that I think there's only one encounter in this entire game that was not revealed during trailers. I mean, even that one I could say they heavily suggested it would be happening, and they showed like a clip from the cutscene that happens before it. So like maybe that one doesn't even count. It's just really unfortunate. There's no surprises in this game at all. Even still, the boss fights we do have are enjoyable enough, often with interesting movesets, AoE attacks, and a really impressive scarring system where each bullet hit or melee attack will leave its mark on the metal of the robot you're fighting, something which happens for all of the androids you encounter in the game, assuming you have your graphics settings set high enough. As I mentioned earlier, these bosses can be extremely difficult difficult. Even after I'd fully upgraded my character's health, he was still getting tossed around like a rag doll no matter what I did. There are many times when I would say that these encounters are more frustrating than fun for sure. At the end of the day, difficult boss fights are really only enjoyable as far as I'm concerned if they feel fair. The moment the player feels that they took damage or died as a result of something beyond their control, they will grow frustrated and bitter, and this is why games like Elden Ring are so impressive, because they manage to offer a challenge while also maintaining a sense of fairness. If you die during a boss fight, it's because you messed up, not because the enemy robot had some unfair advantage against you. But the unfairness in Atomic Heart, unfortunately, comes from disproportionate and inconsistent damage from the boss, iffy hitboxes, which are also very inconsistent, slow bullet velocity, making it feel like you're firing a water gun at times, and general technical issues. We'll touch on the latter much more here in just a second, but for now, let's just say that these boss fights did very little to win me back after my frustrations from the opening handful of hours. They're visually stunning, and you can certainly understand how many people looking at these boss fights in trailers would find this to be convincing enough a reason to get the game or to download it on Game Pass and give it a shot. But in practice, they just aren't implemented very well. And with only a few distinct boss encounters in the entire game, you'll start to wonder what exactly Atomic Heart does well. It's certainly not the story that it does well, as it's extremely predictable, helmed by a protagonist that has the charisma of a damp paper towel, with extremely uninteresting supporting characters that forces you to go through a handful of broad activities that are bloated with needless tedium time and time again, with the occasional boss fight that we've already seen sprinkled inside. These motions through which you go are visually compelling, featuring some amazing music, which really does deserve all of the credit that it has received up to this point, and these encounters in general are initially very cool, but as the game goes on, you'll start to realize that this is just a one-trick pony, and Atomic Heart really doesn't have anything else to show than the occasional pretty set piece, boppin' music, and interesting, though underdeveloped, gameplay idea. Now, as for technical issues, we do have to address this. I am running this game mostly off of this gaming PC right here. This is running a 4090 Zotac, whatever the crap, and 12900K. We have DDR5 RAM in it. Like, all of the games run off of M.2 SSDs. I give this game every benefit of the doubt. So when I go through technical issues, just remember I am experiencing those with this computer. So if your hardware isn't quite up to this level, it's quite possible you'll be encountering even more severe issues, especially in the graphics department when I describe those. So just to be completely clear, these issues were present on this computer and also on my gaming laptop upstairs, which runs a 3070. Across both computers, I had these issues, so it's not just an isolated thing. I ran into a handful of strange issues during my playthrough. A couple of hard crashes where the game inexplicably crashed all the way to the desktop. A couple of glitches where audio would continue playing even after circumstances changed, such as in this really strange instance where an android was sprinting towards me when I killed him, but the sound effect of him running within the echoey metallic room just continued to play back behind me to my left in my headphones even after I left the room and entered a new area. And this was something that only fixed itself once I reloaded. Or this really frustrating glitch which happened repeatedly through most of the cutscenes in the game, where an element of UI stayed on the screen even during cinematics, such as in this weird robotic ballet sequence, which has already been shown in trailers and things, so this is not a spoiler. For this entire sequence, there was just on the left side a remnant of UI sticking there. It was really, really weird. It's just reading metal parts, and that's it. This is because when you loot in the game, you'll do it just by holding down F or right bumper if you're playing with a controller, and that'll just basically pull things out of drawers and cabinets and things. It's really cool. I kind of like it. It feels nice. However, when it does this, it gives you a list of all the stuff that's been looted on the left side of the screen. And apparently the game just glitches out a ton where it doesn't clear all of the items shown on that little list. And so you just end up with pieces of UI that stay on the screen, even in cutscenes, which are like kind of cool otherwise and interesting. You just have to stare at this thing. It's just stupid. And to be clear, this happened in a ton of cutscenes, like probably the overwhelming majority of cutscenes I had, including end game cutscenes right at the very end before credits start rolling. It's really, really weird. And speaking of really weird glitches towards the end of the game, the last cutscene glitched out for me and was just a white frame. So like during the final little speech dialogue, no spoilers or anything. The screen was just white, and then the credits are supposed to start scrolling by. It was just white. Like, this is what it looked like. It's just a white screen. I don't know like what to tell you. It was just really weird. Like, I was like, oh, well, maybe they'll pull this together in the final like cutscene. They'll set it up for a sequel or something cool, and then I'll be like, oh, the story was worth it. But no, it glitched out for me. Just a solid white screen. Gotta love it. But setting all of these things aside, in general, the game ran fairly well for me. It's also fairly scalable, running surprisingly well on my Steam Deck, where I got a smooth 60 for most of the time on low settings. One little tidbit to note is that roughly 2.5, 3 days before the review embargo lifts for this review going up, they issued an update to the Steam version of the game, which I was playing on, which basically re-downloaded the entire game. And when they did that, the game started performing significantly worse than it did before. It's like the Callisto Protocol all over again. So I don't know what exactly they did. Hopefully they fix it in the day one patch, whatever. But the game was running way better before they did that patch, both on the Steam Deck and on PC. So hopefully the day one patch brings all of it together and it starts working well again. I don't know what they did with that attempted update or patch. Hopefully that wasn't the day one patch, but I guess time will tell. But I do want to note that the game previously was running very, very well. And since they did that, it's been running way worse. So hopefully they fix it. But I have no news or word on whether or not that will happen. There's a big question mark, basically. All told, I generally really enjoyed my time with Atomic Heart. However, I feel as though it fails to tie its ideas together in a coherent manner. The combat systems have a ton of potential in my opinion, but poor enemy variety and inconsistent difficulty and enemy balancing makes it really tough to feel both consistently challenged and satisfied. The world is captivating and is extremely interesting on the surface, and it's an open world which I would be happy to explore in a sequel, which is why it feels all the more frustrating that we only get to see it here in passing. The version we get to explore in this game is riddled with dozens of identical robots, buildings that are copy and pasted with the same handful of furniture pieces, bins, and bookshelves for you to search through, and it's so tightly designed with narrow roads and bridges that it never really feels as though you're getting to explore it yourself, but rather that you are simply going through the motions as dictated by the gameplay and narrative designers. I think this franchise has a ton of potential, and Atomic Heart is a great first step, as clunky as it is in parts, and as frustrating as its missteps are, it's still one hell of a ride, and the fact that it's available on Game Pass day one makes it a no-brainer for those of you who are members already. For those of you who may be buying this for full price, I would say definitely wait until you've seen reviews or a Digital Foundry breakdown on whether or not this will run well on your particular hardware, or if you're on Steam, go and get it, and if it sucks ass, then you can just refund it, because I mean that's why the refunds are there, right? So I mean you can do it that way. As for console performance, I have no idea. I didn't ask for a console code, so I frankly just don't know. So if you're looking to play on console, definitely check out how this thing runs on that particular platform before buying it, because I would hate for you to buy a copy of the game and then not be able to play it because it's really broken on your platform. The fact that I'm running into technical issues on this computer makes me very concerned for other hardware that maybe is not quite as powerful as this, so I will just say, do your homework. As for the game itself, I'd say it's good, not great. It's a wonderful first step, but it's one that doesn't quite live up to the standard laid out by this game's inspiring predecessor. To wrap it up, I'll use an analogy. This game is like one of those really fancy wedding cakes that you'll see on the Food Network or like, you know, some show on Netflix. It looks beautiful and you're like, wow, if they could make it look that good, surely it's going to taste even better, right? But the moment you cut in, you realize that it's mostly PVC, cardboard, and dowels, just making it take the overall structure and appearance and form of a cake. And what little cake is actually there is just dry and stale. Hopefully that made sense. Translation, I think the game is like really pretty, but if the game did not look as good as it does, I think there would be no question that this is like a solid 7 out of 10. It's fine. It's not great. There's a lot of problems, but because it's pretty, maybe you give it an 8 out of 10. It's cool to look at. But as for everything else, it just doesn't really do anything well. It's just every step of the way. They just do everything kind of in a lame way when they could have done it in a cool way. And it's just kind of like, so close. So close. But that's going to do it for me. Thank you for watching. Thanks for chilling with me through this skeptical review. I appreciate it. And as always, if you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe, like the video, share it with a friend who's been interested in atomic heart. If you feel so inclined, that's probably the best way to help this channel out, is just by word of mouth and sharing videos. And also come over and say hi in the live stream. And if you have any questions I didn't answer in this review, you can come and ask them of me live right now, and I'd be happy to answer. We also post a ton of like live stream clips and highlights and things. Basically any video that just doesn't fit on this channel, we put over there, and it works great and people love it. And I would love for you to be one of the members over there, one of the subs over there. We would just love to have you. But with that, I'm gonna go to bed. Much love. Thanks for chilling, and I'll see you in the next one. Hugs and kisses. Bye-bye.